Welcome, survivors, to the edge of the apocalypse, where every story is a fight to stay alive. Thanks from the bottom of my heart for every like, comment, and sub. Keep hitting that bell and join the fight with me. Thanks from the bottom of my heart.
I should have died in the first 10 seconds when the television screen suddenly turned blood red. The high-pitched, ear-piercing screech of the emergency broadcast system had been blaring for 20 solid minutes. But I was too busy yelling at my landlord on the phone to actually listen to the automated voice. That was my first, and arguably fatal, mistake. If I had just looked out the window, I would have seen my neighbor, Mrs. Gable, sprinting on all fours across the front lawn with her jaw completely unhinged. But I didn't. I just assumed it was another routine test, another annoying false alarm meant to disrupt my Tuesday evening. By the time the thick glass of my sliding patio door shattered downstairs, the world as I knew it had already ended. I'm making this recording because I know I won't survive what's currently waiting for me down in the basement. There's something ancient and terrifying down there. Something the emergency broadcast specifically warned us about right before the entire city's power grid failed. But before I tell you exactly what that is, and why you should absolutely never, under any circumstances, unlock your deadbolts after sunset, you need to understand how the first 3 hours went down. Because the monsters waiting outside in the dark aren't mindless. They're learning. It all started as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The air inside my living room suddenly felt unusually heavy, thick with a strange, rusted iron scent that I initially blamed on the old radiator. My phone violently buzzed in my pocket, a localized Amber Alert, but the text on the screen was severely glitching. It displayed random, chaotic strings of numbers, followed by one single, coherent phrase. Do not look at them. Naturally, human curiosity is a fatal disease. I slowly walked over to the blinds, my heart thumping a steady rhythm against my ribs, and pulled a single plastic slat down with a trembling index finger. The streetlights outside were flickering violently, casting long, distorted, unnatural shadows onto the pavement. At first glance, everything looked perfectly normal. Perfectly still. But it was too still. The neighborhood dogs, normally a chorus of obnoxious barking at this hour, were dead silent. The crickets had stopped. The wind had died entirely. Then I saw him. A man was standing under the flickering amber glow of the street lamp at the corner of Elm and 4th. He was facing completely away from my house, absolutely motionless. He didn't look like a zombie from the movies. There was no decaying flesh, no dragging of the feet, no guttural moans. He was wearing a sharp, tailored gray suit and holding a leather briefcase. But his neck was violently snapped backward at an impossible 90-degree angle, the back of his skull resting flat against his shoulder blades. And despite facing the opposite direction, his eyes, wide, bloodshot, and completely frantic, were staring directly up into my second-story window. Directly at me. My breath instantly hitched in my throat. I let go of the blind, stumbling backward away from the glass. The emergency broadcast on the television behind me suddenly shifted from that deafening alarm tone to a static-filled, panicked human voice. They mimic. Do not let them hear you speak. Repeat, they will use the voices of your loved ones to get inside. I scoffed nervously, my brain desperately trying to rationalize the sheer absurdity of the situation. It's a prank, I told myself. A sick, elaborate viral stunt. I frantically reached for my cell phone to dial 911, but the screen was dead. Not out of battery, completely bricked. The display was pitch black, yet a faint, wet audio crackle emanated from the tiny speaker. Then, a voice whispered through the receiver. It was my mother's voice. She had been dead for 6 years. Sweetie, it's so cold out here. Please, just unlock the door. The phone slipped from my sweating palms and slammed heavily against the hardwood floor. A loud, sharp thud echoed through the silent living room. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The man on the TV had just warned me about noise. For 5 agonizing seconds, absolutely nothing happened. Then came the sound. It wasn't a feral groan or a violent bashing against the wood. It was a synchronized, rhythmic tapping. Coming directly from my front door downstairs. Tap. 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 Not frantic, but polite. Horrifyingly deliberate. I crept toward the entryway, silently grabbing the heavy iron fireplace poker from the hearth. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely maintain my grip. I tiptoed down the stairs, holding my breath, and pressed my eye against the peephole. The man in the gray suit was standing on my porch. But he wasn't alone anymore. Behind him, cramming my entire driveway and spilling out into the street, were dozens of people. The mailman, the teenager who mows my lawn, a uniformed police officer. All standing perfectly still in the dark. All with their heads snapped backward at that same terrifying, broken angle. The man in the suit raised his pale hand, tapping his knuckles lightly against the solid oak door. Tap. 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 Then, his lips peeled back into a sickeningly wide, ear-to-ear grin, exposing far too many teeth. He spoke, projecting clearly through the heavy wood, using my dead mother's voice once again. We know you're looking at us. Open up. I backed away, the horrific truth finally washing over me in a wave of pure dread. The broadcast hadn't just been a precautionary warning. It had been a countdown. And I had completely wasted my only head start. I bolted toward the kitchen to barricade the back door, but stopped dead in my tracks. The sliding glass patio door. I suddenly remembered the loud shattering sound I heard while arguing on the phone 20 minutes ago. The cool night air was now blowing freely into the kitchen, carrying that awful metallic scent of blood. Someone, or something, was already inside the house with me. And the wet, heavy footsteps slowly dragging across the kitchen linoleum told me it was standing right between me and the only exit. I held my breath until my lungs burned. A silhouette dragged itself past the refrigerator, bathed in the pale, flickering light of the street lamp outside. It used to be my neighbor, Mr. Henderson. But his lower jaw was hanging at a sickening, impossible angle, exposing bone and shredded muscle. And his eyes were completely rolled back into his skull. He let out a wet, rattling gurgle. I backed away slowly, but my heel clipped the base of the kitchen island. A ceramic bowl wobbled off the counter, tipped, and shattered against the tiles. The sound was deafening. Mr. Henderson's head snapped toward me with unnatural speed. He didn't just walk, he lunged, his bloody fingers clawing at the air. I scrambled backward, desperately throwing a heavy wooden barstool into his path. It bought me exactly 2 seconds. I threw myself into the narrow hallway and yanked open the basement door, diving inside. His body slammed against the wood before I could fully close it, a rotting arm shoving through the gap. I pushed back with every ounce of strength I had, screaming as his decaying nails scraped my forearm, tearing through my shirt. I finally forced the door shut and slammed the deadbolt into place. The wood bowed as he hammered against it from the kitchen. I collapsed onto the top step, gasping for air in the pitch black, my heart threatening to crack my ribs. But as my breathing slowed, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. From the deep shadows at the bottom of the basement stairs, I heard a low, wet scraping sound. I had locked myself inside with another one. The wet scraping stopped, immediately replaced by a ragged, gurgling wheeze. I was trapped. The basement door against my back buckled under another violent slam from the kitchen, the deadbolt groaning against the splintering wood. Below me, the wheezing grew louder, followed by the heavy thud of a bare foot hitting the bottom step. It was coming up. I fumbled frantically in my pocket for my phone, my shaking fingers slipping on the glass. The battery was at 4%. I hit the flashlight. A blinding white beam cut through the pitch black, illuminating the steep staircase. Just 3 steps down stood my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Gable. But half her jaw was torn away, her floral nightgown drenched in thick crimson. Her milky, dead eyes locked onto the glare, and she lunged upward with a terrifying, unnatural screech. I kicked out blindly, my heavy boot connecting with her chest, sending her tumbling backward into the shadows. But the impact knocked the phone from my grasp. It clattered down the wooden steps, coming to rest on the cold concrete floor below. Its beam shot across the basement, highlighting the dusty workbench. Right in the center rested my heavy steel crowbar. It was my only chance to survive the night, but to get it, I had to go down there. As the phone's light flickered, I saw Mrs. Gable violently twitching back to her feet. Then, from the pitch-black corners of the basement, 2 more horrific silhouettes stepped into the beam. 3 of them. My chest tightened so hard I couldn't draw a breath. Mrs. Gable let out a wet, rattling hiss, her jaw hanging at a grotesque angle as she lurched toward the bottom step. I had seconds before they bottled me up on the narrow staircase. If I retreated, I was trapped and defenseless. If I pushed forward, I was jumping straight into a meat grinder. I squeezed my eyes shut, took a desperate breath, and vaulted down the remaining wooden steps. My boots hit the concrete just as Mrs. Gable's blood-slicked fingers swiped at my jeans. I shoved past her shoulder, the sickening squelch of cold flesh sliding against my jacket, and sprinted for the workbench. But the 2 new silhouettes blocked the path. It was my landlords, the Millers, their faces chewed into unrecognizable masks of torn tissue. Mr. Miller snapped his rotting teeth inches from my neck. I dove under his grasping arms, sliding across the damp floor, and slammed hard into the wooden bench. My fingers scrambled frantically over the dusty surface. Loose nails, a rusty wrench. There. The heavy steel of the crowbar met my trembling grip. I spun around, raising the iron high as a deafening shriek echoed off the concrete walls. But as I braced for the impact, my heel crushed my fallen phone. The flashlight sparked and died, plunging the basement into absolute, suffocating darkness. I stood completely blind, listening to the wet dragging of their feet closing in. Then, a freezing, mangled hand clamped tightly around my bare ankle. I kicked violently, feeling my heel connect with a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage. The freezing grip on my ankle loosened just enough for me to tear my leg free. Blind panic completely took over. I swung the crowbar in a desperate, wide arc through the pitch-black air. The heavy iron connected with something solid with a wet, heavy thud, followed by a body collapsing to the floor. But the dragging sounds didn't stop, they multiplied. The stench of copper and rotting meat filled my lungs. There wasn't just one down here. I scrambled backward, my hands frantically tracing the damp concrete wall until my fingers finally caught the wooden railing of the staircase. I threw myself up the steps, crawling blindly on all fours. My shins scraped against the raw wood as gnashing teeth snapped furiously mere inches from my shoes. I lunged through the threshold, slamming the basement door shut just as a heavy mass crashed into the other side. I slammed the deadbolt home, my lungs burning, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I slumped against the splintering wood, listening to the feral scratching and guttural howling from below. For a fleeting second, I thought I had survived. Then, a freezing draft kissed the back of my neck. I slowly lifted my head, my eyes finally adjusting to the pale moonlight bleeding into the hallway. The front door, the one I had securely deadbolted just an hour ago, was standing wide open. And a trail of wet, bloody footprints led directly into my kitchen. The metallic tang of copper hit the back of my throat before I even heard the sound. Wet, rhythmic tearing. It echoed from the dark void of my kitchen, accompanied by the sickening crunch of cartilage. I pressed both hands over my mouth to choke back a sob, my lungs screaming for oxygen. The front door's deadbolt hadn't been picked. The solid oak frame itself was shattered outward. Something hadn't just wandered in. It had breached my home with terrifying, unnatural strength. I needed a weapon. My aluminum baseball bat was leaning against the coat rack 10 feet away, but those 10 feet were an ocean of notoriously squeaky hardwood. The scratching from the basement below continued, meaning I was trapped in the middle. I pushed off the wall, my sweat-soaked socks making zero noise as I took a single, trembling step forward. Crack. Another bone snapped in the kitchen, followed by a wet, gargling wheeze. As I crept agonizingly closer to the bat, the pale moonlight illuminated the intruder hunched over my kitchen island. It was Officer Miller. I recognized his torn, reflective utility belt. But his jaw was completely unhinged, hanging by red threads as he gorged on whatever he had dragged inside. My trembling fingers finally brushed the cold metal of the bat. At that exact second, the floorboard beneath my heel let out a deafening, high-pitched squeak. The wet chewing stopped instantly. Miller's twisted silhouette froze in the dark. Slowly, his head snapped around 180 degrees, his cervical spine popping like heavy bubble wrap. But his milky, dead eyes weren't the worst part. The police radio clipped to his shredded belt suddenly crackled to life, and a panicked voice screamed, "Do not engage!" I repeat, they are hunting in pairs. If you see one feeding, it means the alpha is already right behind you. The radio cut out to a hiss of dead static. My blood turned to ice. Every hair on the back of my neck stood on end as a low, wet growl vibrated through the floorboards directly behind my heels. A heavy drop of warm, foul-smelling saliva hit my shoulder. I didn't look back. I just threw my weight forward, diving blindly over the shattered coffee table just as a massive, grotesque hand swiped through the empty air where my head had been a fraction of a second before. I crashed hard onto the hardwood, scrambling backward. The alpha wasn't just another walking corpse. It was massive, its muscles tearing through its clothes, its jaw unhinged and dripping. Before I could process the nightmare, Miller shrieked and lunged from the front, cutting off my only path to the front door. I was trapped. Adrenaline took the wheel. I grabbed the edge of a tall oak bookshelf and pulled it down with everything I had left, crushing the alpha under hundreds of pounds of wood and paper. I didn't wait to see if it worked. I bolted for the basement door, sliding on the slick, bloody floorboards, and threw myself inside. I slammed the heavy door shut and rammed the deadbolt home just as a monstrous force collided with the other side, instantly splintering the wood frame. I backed slowly down the stairs into the pitch-black cold, my lungs burning, convinced I had just bought myself a few more minutes of life. I fumbled for the flashlight in my pocket and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, sweeping across the concrete floor before stopping dead in the far corner. My heart stopped. I wasn't alone down here. And the thing staring back at me from the shadows made me realize I had just locked myself inside the worst place on earth. The beam of my flashlight trembled, illuminating pale, gray skin stretched tight over a dislocated jaw. It crouched on all fours, perfectly silent. I recognized the shredded uniform. It was Mike, the building superintendent. But Mike's eyes were milky white, and his fingers had been chewed down to jagged, splintered bone. Upstairs, a terrifying crack echoed. The barricade was splintering. I was trapped in a concrete box with a monster, and a dozen more were seconds away from breaking in. Mike lunged. He didn't stumble like the ones in the street. He vaulted off a concrete pillar, impossibly fast. I threw my weight sideways, crashing into a metal shelving unit. Paint cans and rusty tools rained down into the dark, knocking the flashlight from my grip. It rolled across the floor, the beams strobing erratically across the basement walls. Every flash revealed him getting closer. I scrambled backward, my fingers desperately sweeping the cold concrete until they wrapped around the heavy steel handle of a pipe wrench. I swung it up blindly just as his weight slammed into my chest, pinning me to the floor. The nauseating stench of rotting copper filled my lungs as his jaw snapped inches from my jugular. I wedged the wrench into his mouth, his teeth shattering against the metal as he pushed down with terrifying strength. Above us, the basement door finally shattered. A chorus of guttural shrieks flooded the stairwell. The horde was pouring in. I kicked upward with both feet, launching Mike's twisted body off me and back into the pitch black. I snatched the flashlight, my beam catching a rusted, heavy steel fire door at the back of the room. The boiler room. I sprinted for it, my lungs screaming as wet, slapping footsteps echoed right behind my heels. I threw my shoulder into the heavy metal door, slipped inside, and slammed it shut, throwing the deadbolt just as a dozen bodies violently impacted the other side. The metal groaned, but it held. I sank to my knees in the suffocating darkness, gasping for air. I had survived. But then, a red light blinked in the corner of the room. A ham radio hissed to life through the static. A panicked voice whispered through the speaker, "If anyone is listening in the quarantine zone, do not trust the military evac teams. I repeat, they are not here to save you. They are." The radio abruptly cut off. And in the dead silence of the boiler room, I heard the distinct click of a revolver being cocked right behind my head.